How do you manage and grow an entrepreneurial business in a controlled way? You follow the Entrepreneurial Method.
This is the Economics for Business podcast. We're here to help all businesses become champions for customers and value, improving lives with preferred and innovative products and services. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Many people seem to fear entrepreneurship, whether in managing and growing a business, or managing a new project, or leading an innovation initiative, or administering an R&D budget, or pursuing any new way of doing things. It's a fear of the future. What is needed in such a situation is a control strategy. When you fear the future, you're in a situation where you can't predict it and you can't control it. And we tend to desire one or both of those things. But here's the real thing. If you can control the future, there's no need to predict it. So we can eliminate one uncontrollable variable, prediction. Don't even attempt it. But you can't control the future, you'll say. That's correct. So don't attempt that either. So what remains? The most productive and beneficial approach to building great futures ever devised, the entrepreneurial method. The secret is to become knowledgeable and discerning about what you can control. When you've thought carefully about that, your head is in a different space. Your confidence is high and your fear goes away. You're ready for entrepreneurship. There's a lot more to it, of course, as we'll find out today. We're very privileged to speak with Dr. Saras Sarasvathy. She is one of the authors of a book that's been a Bible of mine, entitled Effectual Entrepreneurship. She's authored papers with titles like What Makes Entrepreneurs Entrepreneurial? And Entrepreneurship as a Method, and Marketing Under Uncertainty. She's been an entrepreneur and so brings practical expertise to her theories. She's certainly one of the topmost thinkers about entrepreneurship as a real-world business application. She teaches in business school as the Paul Hamaker Professor of Business Administration at the Darden School of Business in the University of Virginia. Dr. Sarasvathy, welcome to the Economics for Business podcast.
Great to be here, Hunter. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much. This is going to be a great episode for us. I'm going to call you Saras from now on. Is that okay?
Absolutely, no problem.
So we've all been brought up to recognize and practice the scientific method. It kind of rules our lives in the world. It's gathering data through observation. It's formulating hypotheses. It's experimental testing. It's the refinement of those hypotheses. And now you reveal to us that there's an entirely different method for, you call it social science, but we'll include in that economics and business. It's the entrepreneurial method. And we'll establish that first, but we'll keep in mind that you're saying that this can make an equivalent and maybe even superior contribution to progress and civilization. That's a wonderful vista. So let's define the entrepreneurial method, Saras, in any way that you would like to start.
So the scientific method is the idea that there is a systematic way for us to understand the universe, and that there are many, many aspects of it that are actually teachable, and we can teach it even to fifth graders. So the idea behind the scientific method is not that we are going to create Einsteins in the classroom, but that we are going to tease out and spell out systematic ways of approaching knowledge, right? And so the idea behind the entrepreneurial method has the same kind of purposes and viewpoints in terms of education. That is, there are many things about entrepreneurship, actually many more things about entrepreneurship in some way than we currently teach. So for the most part, most people teach toolboxes, but the idea of the entrepreneurial method says that there are systematic things that you can learn about being entrepreneurial, about thinking entrepreneurially about all kinds of problems in the world. And unlike the scientific method, it's not about just observation and knowledge about the universe. This is about how we can sort of work together to achieve human purposes, including designing new purposes worth achieving through this method. So it's a method that can put the scientific method to work to do some of the things we wanted to do as well. So it is a method like the scientific method, but the purpose of this method is different. It is still a set of systematic things that we can teach people beyond just toolboxes.
And you say in terms of outcomes, we're not going to judge it by the number of entrepreneurs we create or the number of ventures or how big they get and so on. We're not going to judge science by the number of Nobel Prize winners it produces. We're looking at different outcomes. We're looking at a different purpose, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So in science, the one of the overarching metrics is how well we can predict the future, right? So if we understand certain laws of physics or of cosmology or biology, there are things that we can do so the world becomes a little bit predictable, and so we understand the universe, and then we can accumulate the knowledge. And entrepreneurship, interestingly, is the flip side of the coin, right? It's about dealing with unpredictability in the human sphere, but it's not about predicting human behavior or predicting human outcomes, but to get more of the world within our control for the things that we want to do, right? So the aim of the entrepreneurial method is actually control, not prediction. So in science, you think about it, the better we can predict the future, the better we can control our outcomes. Entrepreneurs learn through the school of hard knocks, I call it. They learn the hard way now that if you can turn control into a strategy, that when you start thinking about the world in terms of things within your control, things outside your control, then you can put the things within your control to work, to do all kinds of things which nobody can predict, including you cannot predict. And so it's a way of achieving unpredictable things using control as a strategy. So it is in this sense that entrepreneurship and science are sort of flip sides of each other. And that is why you will have these methods that work together. And in both cases, the metric ought not to be how many geniuses we produce in class, because we never produce geniuses in class, right? What we do is no matter who walks in with whatever abilities they have, what we try to do in good education is get them to the next level, get them to think scientifically, even behave scientifically, understand science in such a way that we can build scientific infrastructure in society. And so, same thing we can do for entrepreneurship. They can now start to think more entrepreneurially about problems, behave more entrepreneurially, and make the world easier in some ways to build through entrepreneurial tactics. So we need to build entrepreneurial infrastructure to build a better human life and society. And that's the way I think about it. So the metrics ought to be really, what are we teaching, and are we able to teach it, and are we teaching it well, not what people do with what we teach. When we start engineering what people can or should do based on our education, it is no longer education, right? It's some kind of brainwashing, and we do not want that. I think von Mises would be with me on that one. The whole idea of education is to free you to do the things you want to do with the knowledge. It's not really about cramming stuff into your head so we all march to the same tune.
Yeah, we agree with that. Help us a little bit with the control axis, Saras, because it sounds like a lot of things for entrepreneurship are out of our control. In fact, the concept of adaptiveness, which you include in the entrepreneurial method, kind of means being not in control. So just help us with that idea.
So the idea here is people are not, very realistic in understanding what is actually within their control versus what is not, right? And so when they come into entrepreneurship, because it is not a regular paying job where somebody gives you a job's description and you show up for work 9 to 5, whatever, and then you get a paycheck. That seems like very processable for lots of human brains, right? The idea of entrepreneurship, everybody starts saying, oh my God, it's so risky because nobody's guaranteeing you a paycheck. And you have to decide, are you working 9 to 5, 9 to 9? You take Wednesdays off instead of Sundays. Like you have a lot of uncertainty, and it seems in some ways maybe it means that I have more time and everything within my control, but it also seems like I'm losing control because I don't have a paycheck, so I don't know where the next dime is going to come from. So what the entrepreneurs learn the hard way is they start realizing that you have to become more sensitive to what is within your control and what is not. And then once you're sensitive, you realize suddenly that A, there are many more things within your control than you think. And B, just given the things that are within your control, even if you are, as I say, poor illiterate woman in Bangladesh, right? You still have things within your control and you can do amazing things with that. And so the heart of the entrepreneurial method is to always focus on the doable, and then you get to decide whether it's worth doing or not. So the idea of control here is not about outcomes, right? It's not about saying like I can decide to make a product and then make $1 million. That's not the control. The control is really, what do I have available readily to me today, and what kinds of things can I do with it to get me to something that I want? And so the idea is to begin to think about control as strategy. And if you think certain things are outside your control, don't waste time worrying about all the things that are outside your control or all the resources that you don't have. So then you end up chasing people with resources all the time. So we have been teaching entrepreneurship as if that's what entrepreneurs do. No, entrepreneurs are very, very good at working with almost nothing and figuring out ways to do interesting things with them so that people with resources then want to come and work with them, right? Because they're doing something new. So the idea is to really do things with very little resources in such a way that resources come after you, right? Not that you are chasing resources. So that is one of the most surprising things that I found by studying these expert entrepreneurs. And Hunter, you know that a lot of this comes from the experiences of entrepreneurs. My research is actually a very serious, rigorous look into the learnings of entrepreneurs. That's where the insights actually come from. I just get to like gather them together and name them and then build on them in some ways. So these are lessons that entrepreneurs actually learn, this idea that you have to become sensitive to things within your control, and that there are more things within your control than you think, and B, that you can do more stuff with things that you already have instead of waiting for somebody to hand you other things before you actually act or do anything worthwhile in the world.
Yeah, that's very exciting. In your book, Effectual Entrepreneurship, you mentioned some principles that
Yes.
you found from the study of experiential learning, and you put it in kind of business-like language. You mentioned, for example, starting with what you've got. You call that the bird in the hand principle. Perhaps you could mention some of those principles, Saras, because I found those helpful to apply in real life.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely correct. I also named them in an accessible way for my students to understand. But behind each one of those names is also a larger, more intellectual idea, if you want, and we can talk about it either way. So the first insight from my research was this insight about prediction and control, right? That control is not just an outcome, and that you don't have to think about predicting and gathering resources in order to achieve control. Control itself is strategy. So then I went back into the data and started looking for how exactly do you do that? How do you use control as a strategy? And then I found there were 5 different things that these expert entrepreneurs had learned through their experiences. And those are what I call the 5 principles of effectuation. And each principle minimizes your need to use predictive information and maximizes what you do with things within your control. So let me walk you through all 5 of them very quickly.
Yeah, please.
The first one I call the bird in hand, because it's really just simply dividing the world into things within your control, things outside your control. The things within your control is what I call bird in hand, right? The readily available means. And in the original data, there were 3 kinds of means. Who am I? What do I know? And whom do I know? And the who am I? It's not a very profound question. It's just simple things like what are my tastes? What are my preferences? What are my values? What do I like? What do I not like? And what kinds of things do I enjoy doing? That kind of thing. And then what I know can be formal education, it can be other kinds of skill sets, hobbies, anything that you have. And then whom you know is the people that you can actually reach out and talk with, people in your network, but it could be family and friends and things like that. Just start with that. And then you start thinking about things that you can do that could create value for other people, right? Because if you want to build a business, you have to do something that somebody else is willing to pay for. Mm-hmm. And so you have to imagine some things that other people would want. So you come up with some idea, and initially people are like, that is not very clear, like I could do 1,000 different things, right? And most of them are uninteresting, stupid, mundane ideas. And I tell them, no problem, write them all down, go for it, right? And then sometimes people will come up with 20 different things they could do. So how do you choose which one to do? And then I say the second principle kicks in at this point. Don't worry about which one will make me the most money or make me the most powerful or whatever. Instead, actually ask yourself, which ones would you want to do even if you lose whatever you're willing to invest in it? So this is the affordable loss principle. So you're actually checking things that in terms of your own aspirations and your values. I would love to attempt that. Even if it doesn't work out, it's fine, right? So you're not focused on expected return, which is the way we normally think about choice between projects. Instead, you're looking at affordable loss. So this is again things within your control, but you're also notice now you are also keeping the downside within your control, which means you get to choose what you will lose, right? So you're getting you're getting a choice over the downside in some ways. And why are you thinking that and not worrying about the upside? Because you believe the upside is within your control in the sense of what you do down the road, right? So upside you can push, but downside you don't want to lose what you don't want to afford. You don't want to lose what you cannot afford to lose. So that's the second principle, affordable loss. And the contrast here is affordable loss and expected return. Mm-hmm. But both of these principles are just day one. Right? Day one, you can do this because this is something you can just sit in your room and with a piece of paper and pen or your phone or whatever, and you can come up with this. Day two, you start talking to other people. And that is where a lot of people think you have to talk to people with certain resources, and then you have to convince them, you have to pitch them to give you those resources and bring them on board. But here, remember, you're only coming up with things that you can do, things within your control. So then what are you talking with other people for? So you start talking to people and say, hey, I'm thinking of doing that. What about, what do you think? And would you like to come on board? And what is it that you can do? And that conversation is fascinating because you're not saying, I want to do this. And if you give me that, I will give you this. You're not doing any of the regular pitching. You're just talking to people, asking them what is it they can bring to the table, whether they would like to come on board and what would be the conditions for their coming on board, things like that. And a couple of people will get interested and they start self-selecting into the process, right? Mm-hmm. But as and when anybody gets interested in the process, you're trying to move them to make a commitment to the venture. And each person is committing only what they can afford to lose. It doesn't have to be millions of dollars or anything. But this process that happens, which you cannot predict, right? Because you don't know who's going to want to work with you. So that's why I call it the crazy quilt. So this
Mhm.
is the third principle. The crazy quilt principle is basically that you will work with anybody and everybody, and depending on what they bring to the table, you start stitching together this quilt. And none of us know what this quilt is going to look like at the end, but everybody has a little bit of a say in what it will look like, and who will come on board next and all that. And so that's the crazy quilt. And as the crazy quilt starts building out, things get firmer and firmer. So if you come on board with me and say, hey, you know what, you are doing this video course, what I really would love for us to do together is a podcast. And I say, okay, sure, let's do a podcast. And now I'm involved in a video venture, but I'm also doing a podcast with you. And together we could do something completely different, maybe. And so now the goals get a little bit clearer, and the resources are a little bit clearer, and we also have this growing network. And then you introduce me to somebody else, or I bring in you get to meet some of my team, and so other new things can bubble up. But in this process, of course, let's not forget there are lots of things outside our control, and some of those can just hit us suddenly, whether we like it or not, right?
Mhm.
So this is the lemonade principle, life throwing lemons at you. I know it's kind of cheesy, but the idea really is about contingencies, about surprises, about the unexpected that happens in any creative process. And you can take the stance that these things that happen are ways that are actually resources, not things that throw you off the plan. Here you don't have that, written in the stone plan anyway. So it's actually easier to transform some of these unexpected contingencies into new opportunities. So that's the lemonade principle. And through this process, you end up building something that nobody might have imagined. So you end up literally co-creating the future. And that's the pilot in the plane. So
Mhm.
on this plane, there are no passengers. Everybody is a co-pilot. History does not run on autopilot. So you're not worried about just trends and placing bets on trends. You are literally shaping history. And that's the co-creation or pilot in the plane principle.
A quick note: did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4Bpod. That's MISES.org/E, the number 4, the letter B, POD, and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
That list is really, really helpful. The pilot in the plane concept leads us to another point. I noted something that you wrote. It says the course of the venture is created in the process of doing.
Yes.
You stress all the time, I think, this idea of doing, of action, of agency. So we're not trying to predict the future, we're trying to do things. Just talk a little bit more about doing as a principle, Saras.
Yes. So the entire theory of effectuation, the principles, the process, everything is driven by action, right? Everything is driven by human agency, things that you care about and things that you actually can do. So action, in fact, you can rearrange the entire model if you want, in terms of action, interaction, and reaction, if you want to. And all of them have agency in them, right? So action is things that I can do, interaction is things that we can do together, and reaction is how we handle surprises, right? So the idea is really in all of this, that is kind of this active agency, in the sense that we are going to actively shape things. So we are not only just reacting in the sense of adapting, although some of the time we will do that too, but we feel more control. We have this understanding that action reshapes the world. So if you want to think about it in biological terms, right, I always say think about the otters, right? That we think that adaptation only involves like you're adjusting to something, the world is out, but the otters like they build like entire, they change the course of the river, right? The only difference between otters and us, and this is a hypothesis, is that we are conscious about it, doing it. We can say we wanted to go west instead of east, right? Maybe the otters are not doing that. But the fact is, living involves agency, right? It's not possible to interact without it's not possible to interact with any environment without changing it in some way. All we are bringing to the table here, the entrepreneurs are bringing to the table, is that consciousness, the idea of purpose, and it's purpose with a little humility though, because they are saying that we can also change purpose itself, that we are purposeful beings, but we can also learn from each other and come up with more purposes worth achieving. But the only way you do that is I actually try to build something and you build something with me. It's not a philosophical exercise, right? It's not we are not sitting in some room, closing our eyes and dreaming up what is worth doing. We are actually trying stuff out, and all of a sudden we learn things that we can do that we never imagined before. And there's that interactivity that happens, whether it's with the physical world or with other human beings, is crucial to entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and there's another piece, Saras. I'm trying to make a segue here from you called what you just described non-predictive action. So I'll do things without entirely knowing what the future holds. But you also identify a new way of thinking.
Yes.
You call it even if thinking.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, you did read stuff, didn't you?
Oh, I did.
Most people have never heard of that.
Well, let's have you describe even if thinking and how it applies to the entrepreneurial method, and then I've got another question about it. But please tell us about even if thinking.
Okay, the idea behind even if has to do with the fact that very often our aspirations and the outcomes that we are thinking about are not symmetric. Let me explain that. For example, when you think about success and failure, a lot of people think that it's some kind of 0 1 variable, right? That if I don't succeed, I've failed, or if I fail, I'm not a success. And we know in actual fact that that's not how success failure works, right? Success and failures are more nuanced in their relationship with each other, and entrepreneurs learn that, right? Not succeeding, not failing is not success. Like the moment I say it that way, everybody sort of gets it. But at the same time, we also default, oh, I don't want to fail, so therefore I don't want to do it. We make decisions like that all the time, not understanding that not failing is not, it doesn't mean you're successful, right? Yeah. So the classic example of even if thinking comes, and this came from the classroom, literally. So students would say, well, there is an opportunity cost to my starting a company, right? Especially my MBA students in this beautiful school here, I initially, they would always ask this: how do you make this decision to leave a job? Something maybe you're earning like $200,000 a year. How do you leave that job and start a company? And so they saw this as this insurmountable problem because the opportunity cost was huge on one side, and then the uncertainty was huge on the other side. And then just out of sheer, frustration or whatever, or brilliance. I like to think it's brilliance. I just asked the question to my students: what's the opportunity cost of not starting a venture? And it was like silence for a second, right? And I let them stew in it for a while, and then we had a conversation, and some of the students went off, and then one of the students had read about Jeff Bezos talking about regret minimization, right? As is the reason you start a company, things like that. So when through that discussion, it became very clear that it's not symmetrical, because on the one side, you're earning whatever 100,000, 200,000 a year, and you can calculate the net present value. And on the other hand, it could be like you could be a billionaire with 7 planes and 3 boats and whatever. or maybe you don't have anything. So and I started realizing that the students didn't have a very clear idea of the downside, right? They had all kinds of illusions about, like, I'd be homeless, to the ridiculous stuff. So I said, no, you'll be back in that job, the $200,000 job. Maybe you will be earning only 150,000, right? That's your worst case scenario. But and so the way is we started thinking about is, even if the entrepreneurship, even if the venturing idea doesn't work out, what is like the worst that could happen? That's how this conversation led to the idea. But then I started realizing that the much bigger philosophical and logical formulation behind this, because of this asymmetry, when we are comparing choices, there are some choices where you can act as if you know what the future will bring, which is $200,000 a year for the foreseeable future, 20 years or whatever. So you're acting as if you can predict the future. On the other hand, you're making a decision saying, even if this billion dollar multi-plane boat lifestyle I do not get, I can always come back to this other thing. And then all of a sudden, I'm again free to explore this possibility, which seemed like unsurmountable, impossible, when I had this as if thinking on the one side and some weird ideas of, I have no clue what will happen on this side. And that's not correct to say you have no clue. So that even if an asif kind of came from the classroom, practical, but then I started looking into logic, right? Formal logic. And it turns out that it is connected to some interesting things. And then I wrote about the connection to Milton Friedman's asif logic. So now I've worked out some of the more serious logic and philosophical aspects of even if thinking. But I think for your listeners, this example does the job better.
Yeah.
In some ways. And you can now, once you understand it, you can apply this even if logic to a lot of things. Like, for example, for dating, right? Or for making some choices later in life when you want to do something important. Maybe you want to take on a social responsibility. You want to do something for your community, or you want to take up cause. Like, there are many, many different ways. People have even talked about using it in, like, negotiating peace, and there's so there are lots of applications for it. I'm still working out the serious part of the thing, but the example captures it. The idea is to say, on the one hand, we are making decisions as if we can predict the future, but on the other hand, there is a way to deal with the unpredictable by just simply thinking about even if, and making sure the downside is within your control.
Yeah. I will definitely assign that to brilliance, Saras. That's a great.
See, I like that. But in actual fact, it never is, right? It is just conversation with really engaged, intelligent people is what a lot of ideas come from that. And we just claim credit for it. And,
Yeah. So, Saras, with the even if thinking and the entrepreneurial method that you've talked about, you talk about bigger things than venture creation skills. You talk about societal engagement. We always fantasize about an entrepreneurial movement, but you've crystallized that in the idea of a potential for a new middle class of business. So let's understand what you're thinking about when you talk about that, and where we take that idea.
All right. And this is a sort of an organic, natural offshoot of the idea of the entrepreneurial method. Because if you look at the history of science and the scientific method and how it was developed into education for all in some ways, one of the outcomes, or a positive side effect, if you will, of teaching science to everybody and expanding education to everybody is we got the middle class, right? So before the 18th century, for the most part, you just had a few people who are very, very wealthy and a lot of poor people, and there was no such thing as the middle class. So the very idea of middle class is a recent kind of development in human history. And so I started thinking, if we are going to take the analogy of the scientific method into the idea of an entrepreneurial method, what would be the equivalent of a middle class? So that was one thing in the back of my head, but just reading the history of science and scientific method and things like that. But on the other hand, I also know a lot about how entrepreneurship works in the world, right? Having been an entrepreneur and teaching entrepreneurship and working with entrepreneurs and things like that. And I started noticing that there's a lot of government money, all kinds of monies that are going into fostering entrepreneurship, right? Or whatever it is. And in many countries now, they actually officially they have entrepreneurship policies and entrepreneurship education policies as well, and things like that. And so I started looking at where is this money going and what are people doing with that. And it became very clear to me that a lot of the money is going into just getting people to start companies. And it was a little, puzzling that the idea of just simply having more people start companies, why would that be a useful thing? And almost by definition, if you think about it, entrepreneurship is what you do when when you really want to do it or no other options are available to you in a way. So now if you just start throwing money at it and saying, of course a lot of people are going to start companies whether they have ideas or not, and because the money is there. And that is pretty entrepreneurial, by the way. So when I give talks in Europe, they'll tell me we have this problem of the €1 entrepreneur, where we give this seed money and they come and they don't ever start a company that, creates any jobs or anything. But they'll show this €1 profit. So do you think that is entrepreneurship? And I said, anywhere there is free money floating around, somebody comes and gets us. Sure, that's entrepreneurship. And people don't like that. Um, but the idea here was to start thinking about what are we trying to do. And then as I dove deeper into that, I realized that in most economies, just like before the middle class, you had this particular shape in the labor market, right? Most people are indentured servants or peasants or whatever. And then there were a few people and that's what the landscape of business looks like for the most part, right? Very, very, very few companies will grow very large. Most companies are, 1 to 4 people, and then 4 to 10, you have a little bit, and then 10 to 500. And then, so that's how they classify these businesses. So it takes this particular shape, and public money tries to get more people to start companies. That means more small businesses in some ways. And private money literally chases the other end, right? They're chasing unicorns. They're chasing that very, very low probability event of a company growing very large. And so I started thinking that our focus ought not to be on either of these two ends. It's about educating anybody and everybody. Imagine if we had built science that way, right? Whoever is going to do some scientific experiment, you'll get money. You will get a lot of experiments and no results. And that is kind of a rather naive way of going about it. And so I said, what you really want to do is to figure out what is actually teachable, teach a lot of different people, and then people will go out and do stuff, including figure out a way to fund their ventures. And so the idea of public money going into just funding these ventures was bothersome to me, but it was bothersome primarily because of the logic behind it did not hold up. So that's why I started looking into this. So the idea of the middle class of business is simply what I explained, right? Let's teach the entrepreneurial method to anybody and everybody. If you get a shot to go to school, you learn science. Similarly, also learn a little bit about finance, a little bit about entrepreneurship. And then you will have a much more robust economy where people can come in and out of employment and self-employment. They can start companies, they can invest in companies, they can help grow companies, but they can also do social venture. All kinds of venturing activities will happen, including those that we cannot predict or imagine at this point in time. And I think that's what, at the societal level, that's what we should be doing. So all I am trying to do is to make a case that the middle class was not engineered by any policymakers or even by brilliant scientists, right? It was literally a result of the fact that people had the freedom to move between social classes. They got a little bit of education and they figured out a way to convert some of that education into income. And the more number of people started converting it into income, the more the middle class could expand, because then they could also go into consumption. So if you think about how the middle class was formed, I think a similar process will happen. Perhaps even more exciting things would happen, because ventures at the end of the day are more than just income, right? So I can imagine communities developing. I can imagine people being able to take on challenges like climate change, not only through technology, maybe starting to mine the asteroids or whatever, but also in the way we live, without having to just simply come up with little things like, oh, let's recycle or die or something like that. Instead of that, we can actually get more creative, build sustainable communities that actually produce more income and wealth, and also jobs in the economy. So it seems very high-minded the way I am explaining this, but the logic behind is literally coming from the history of science and the history of the middle class. So I think that by teaching entrepreneurship to a lot of people, or actually to literally to everyone, we will start developing a middle class of business. We might even see a reduction in the number of people starting companies, and that's okay, right? Because we want companies that actually last longer and employ enough number of people so that we can have decent communities. That's what we really want, right?
Yeah. In
So
fact,
that's the idea behind the middle class.
well, it's a lovely prospect, and I picked out some of the attributes. You mentioned them a little bit, but there's stability. You talk about durability. You talk about endurance. You talk about non-churn. Counter to Schumpeter, it's not creative destruction. It's this long-term stability. There's growth and there's earnings over time. And then you translate that into well-being. That is a community with greater well-being. So just talk a little bit about the value of endurance and durability.
So, just like a lot of ideals in life, I do not want to. I do not want to overemphasize or oversimplify and think about well-being as a good thing, and non-well-being as a bad thing. Instead, the way I want us to think about is, just like we need creative churn, which Schumpeter talks about, we also need periods of endurance and stability for the products of that creativity to take root and for us to do something with it. So this is much more, it's not really that churn is bad and endurance is good. It's really that churn is being made out to be this unmitigated good in some ways. And I want to push back against that. And I don't want to posit endurance or stability as the ideal, but I think we have overcorrected in one direction. And the idea of endurance and stability is, it allows us to use technology or figure out ways to live better with the new things that are produced through the creative churn, and in the process also get us to the next level of creativity. So I want to talk about endurance not in terms of extraordinarily successful gigantic companies, the unicorns, but also not think about it as just a mom and pop shop, which is a small business, but the kind of business that can take on bigger challenges, like the well-being of a community, like climate change, like just the idea of allowing people to come in and out of education and employment in interesting ways, that kind of thing. So that's what I mean by endurance. We need a certain amount of stability and a certain amount of creative destruction, and both of them have to work, together in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been looking at a company called Schaefer Oil, or Schaefer Oils, I think it is, in St. Louis. It's into its fifth or sixth generation of family management. They started out selling grease to people who are taking wagons to the west so that the wheels would turn on the axles. And they've developed all kinds of lubricant products over time. They now serve farmers by giving them special lubricants for their machines, which save them time and money on maintenance and things like that. It's growing. It's a
Yes.
9-figure revenue business, but it's got that endurance and durability that you talk about. So,
Yeah, a very good, excellent example. Um, there is there's a company in India that something does something very similar. I mean, it's more than 150 years old. It's called the Kirloskars, and they make agricultural equipment, and they do irrigation systems all over Africa and things like that. One of those companies that just year after year, decade after decade, produces value and wealth, employs a lot of people, is involved in, educating rural youth into engineering and things like that. And we don't talk about them as much. For some reason, it's become sexy to talk about these companies that were not around even 15 years ago and probably will not be around in 15 years from now. I just wanted to bring the conversation back that there are very many different kinds of entrepreneurship and ventures out there.
yeah. And one of the things, Saras, that you say when we study entrepreneurship, and we certainly understand the difficulty in doing that, we can't even define it, let alone study it. But you say one of the things we should study more is, use an academic word, intersubjectivity. But you've mentioned what that means in real life a couple of times. It's talking to each other. Uh, it's collaboration. It's community. It's those kinds of things, and we don't study that element of entrepreneurship enough. So just expand on intersubjectivity for us a little bit.
Okay, I would love to tell you about intersubjectivity, but I wanted to make a quick comment on what you said, that we cannot even define entrepreneurship, let alone study it. I want to ask you, you have some interest in things like, biology or physics or knowledge in general. Do biologists agree on a definition of life before they study biology? Do physicists know the definition of mass or gravity or anything? So I always say the most important things in life are not actually definable in that narrow sense. But they're so important that for different purposes, we will create useful definitions and we go ahead and study them anyway. So I think entrepreneurship is a very, very, very big fundamental phenomenon. So we don't have to agree on a definition. So that doesn't bother me.
Yeah. Okay.
That also brings us to intersubjectivity in a way, right? So if you and I are interested in the frontiers of technology and the ventures that build there, right? So we can have a definition that we agree, and then we are willing to invest our time and effort and resources into understanding that better. So that is like an intersubjective understanding, right? So all definitions at the end of the day have to be intersubjective. The interesting thing about intersubjectivity, especially in entrepreneurship, is this idea that you and I can interact, and it's not like we are fully made human beings, right? Who are completely separate and then we come to a deal. It's that we can together come up with something that neither of us had actually thought about or dealt with before. And it is that connectivity with newness, the things that we are not clear about, right? That is where the term intersubjectivity is very important. So it's not interpersonal. You are a person, I am a person, we come to the negotiating table. That's a slightly different kind of interaction than you are saying, I am kind of doing this. What do you think? And I say, and then we end up doing something totally different from what either of us might have imagined. That's what I mean by intersubjective. That's the only difference, actually, that I bring to the table with that word.
Okay, good. And that works inside corporations where you've got multiple people interacting on teams and
Absolutely. And it works in other spheres like science or policy making or any other, medical diagnosis can be intersubjective.
yeah, yeah. Well, let's leave on a high note, Saras. You sound a lot of high notes in your writing, which is very exciting. But you talk about we've mentioned this, co-creating robust communities. You talk about establishing new ends worth achieving, you talk about new levels of human well-being crucial to tackling the problems of the 21st century and beyond. So just leave us with that picture of what the entrepreneurial method, if we teach it and embrace it and pursue it a little bit more, is capable of achieving in your mind.
You're asking me to go even higher. In some ways, so it's very interesting. So the highest we can go in some ways. Let me explain it in teaching terms, because also I love teaching. So at the turn of the 20th century, right? Imagine that I'm a professor and I'm a professor of bicycle mechanics, right? And I know a lot about it. I'm an expert in the field, and I'm teaching bicycle mechanics. So the way I think about the entrepreneurial method is this, right? How do I teach bicycle mechanics in such a way that my students go out and invent airplanes? Because two bicycle mechanics invented airplanes, something that I could not dream of, I could not imagine. Right? I think that is what the entrepreneurial method is all about. It's embracing this idea. It's going away from just simply doing the things we know. So if I walk into a classroom and I'm trying to teach what I know, I'm not as good a teacher as if I'm very aware of all the things that I don't know, and I have to educate in such a way that my students are going to go and make those amazing worlds happen. And those worlds and those things that they go after are going to be actually worth more valuable for me and for humanity. And it's just that attitude. I don't really know how to do it, right? But no, the knowledge that I do not know how to do it, but that is the enterprise I'm a part of, is really the way I think about it. So the high note I'd like to leave us with is, it's not only teaching entrepreneurship, but teaching entrepreneurially, with this idea of the unknown being part of our life and part of our education. So let's get away from kind of this arrogance of knowledge. We'll still work very hard to be competent and expert in everything we do. But when we interact with people, the whole idea is to leave the interaction in such a way that the other person can do even better things than they thought they could. And then you get to sit back and take credit like I do all the time.
Saras, thank you so much for this mind-opening and elevating conversation. It's been a delight, and we thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter. Have a good day.
Economics for Business is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. And for more from Hunter Hastings, visit hunterhastings.com.